Hello, this is Brian Resney, President of Resney Wealth Management, bringing you an important update going into 2026. Now, 25 is essentially over. I'm glad to say our clients had another exceptional year, but our job's not done. 26 is a new year. We're going to reset the table, and let's talk about 26. We see 26 more positive for growth for the U.S. economy. Does that mean higher stock market returns? Potentially, but remember, volatility is normal and expect a pullback of 10 to 15% before we potentially go higher in 26. But all the big, beautiful bill that was put in place basically in the middle of the year by the Trump administration will start forming and has built a foundation in 25 that will gravitate more so for growth in 26, 27, and 28. So we're very excited for 26. But I'll give you a little information. We had over a 4% GDP read for the third quarter of 25 that came out just about a week ago. That is substantially higher than was thought. Remember all the experts out there, the Wall Street firms and the economists, how the Trump taxes and the tariffs and all the things that he was doing at the beginning of essentially 25 and through the big, beautiful bill were going to put us in a recession or slow the economy down? Well, clearly that didn't happen. And we talked about why we were positioned in the U.S., why we felt there's going to be substantial gains for our clients in 25, and we were 100% correct. But again, 26 is a new year. Fiscal progress. We've built the foundation in 25 with the new administration, which will lead to, in our opinion, better GDP growth going forward. And again, that should translate into higher equity-based prices. But again, remember, volatility is normal. 6 steps up, 2 steps down, repeat the process. Expect volatility and expect to get pulled back and a correction before we go to new high ground. If we can frame it that way, and even if we don't have a correction, at least you'll be ready for a correction that may never happen in 26, but most likely we're going to get a pullback. But remember, if we look at the debt and deficit, that's come down slightly from the previous year. It's a work in progress. While I realize we have a lot of debt in the U.S., it's going to be a process over the next 5, 10, 15 years to get a balanced budget and start paying down that debt, in my opinion, over the next 5 years as the economy grows. Biden's spending spree, by the way, most of you probably don't realize this, but whether you're Democrat or Republican, blowing money is not a good way to basically build the U.S. economy. But at the end of Biden's term, trying to win the election, just to give you this in perspective, and these are factual numbers, and everybody should be outraged on these. 40% of the whole spend for 24 under the Biden administration, 40% of that total spend was spent in the last 2 months of the year trying to make the economy look better than it was in order to win an election. Again, that should make everybody mad. That was more debt and deficits, and it didn't really help the economy at all. Let's talk about debt to GDP improvement. Peaked at 6.8% previously, headed toward a mid 5% range for 25 with normal near 6%. Long-term deficit goals. We're on track again to bring that deficit below 3% as GDP ramps up over the coming years. We're stabilizing the debt, and it's going to actually enable us long-term to start paying down the debt. Tariffs, positive impact. Far from causing inflation and certainly did not cause any recession. So again, the economists and Wall Street firms are wrong. Resney Wealth Management, again, got it right. Tariffs for national security. This is a very effective tool, by the way. This helps combat fentanyl problems and deaths and drops and all these different things that ultimately happen from countries like China, Venezuela, and so on. So tariffs are a useful tool not only for economic purposes, but for national security. Also, the revenue outlook. We've brought in over $500 billion in tariff revenues alone into the U.S. coffers. That is huge, while again stemming things that I talked about earlier. There is a potential Supreme Court ruling coming up that will decide what's going to happen with the authority of tariffs. Hopefully things go well. If it doesn't, I think it'll be a small blip in the screen if the Supreme Court comes against the Trump administration for tariffs. But again, I think things will work out. Main Street affordability challenges. Yes, prices are still high. Remember, the previous administration over that 4 years had inflation well over 20% total. All those prices are not coming back to where they were. What we're trying to do is stop inflation going up 6-7% a year and bring it back down to 2, which it's getting close to. Illegal immigration and impact on rents. Let's talk about affordability. What does illegal immigration, bringing in 10 to 20 million illegal immigrants over that time frame, do to rents? It increases them. There's a Wharton study that basically shows a 1% population increase in a city from immigration leads to basically a 1% rise in rents. This influx of 10 to 20 undocumented immigrants drove rents through the roof. Rents are starting to decline, which is good for housing, and that's good for affordability. Inflation, as I mentioned, is cooling. Look at gas prices alone. If you look at oil and per barrel oil, it's down over 20% in 2025. I think we could be in the $50 to $55 oil price range per barrel in 26. Positive. Real incomes are on the rise, 1.8% since inauguration, a positive trend for working Americans. The BLS data reliability, October jobs number, solid despite a lot of critiques. Of course, the Democrats came out and said, oh gosh, we've got unemployment on the rise. Actually not true. Remember, part of DOGE, which is what Elon Musk was involved with, which is getting rid of government waste, there was a proposal put out to government employees, if by the end of October you could actually have a buyout for early retirement, about 125,000 people retired from the government. That added to what looks like a higher unemployment number, but in fact it was people voluntarily retiring and taking the early retirement. Fed's past mistakes, prolonged QE, quantitative easing, exacerbated inequality by inflating asset prices and hurting savers and wage earners. Fed reforms needed. Candidates like Walsh, Hassett, Waller are really people that are going to help really for the Fed reforms, I think, going forward and help all Americans, poor, middle class, and the rich alike. Interest rates and debt. Think about this. The U.S. bond remains attractive globally and strong demand is reflected. Even though we have a lot of debt, people still want our bonds. I don't see that changing. 26 outlook for Main Street. More credit from community banks. No more deficit fueling for inflation. Rising wages. CapEx is turning into broad employment gains. Strategic investments. Target equity stakes. 5 to 8 key industries like semiconductors, pharmaceutical, steel. This is going to help ensure the production and national security for America. Major tax cuts are going to hit soon. Retroactive for 25. Again, no tax on tips, overtime, Social Security deductibility. These are all things that are going to be very, very positive for the U.S. consumer and the growth of the U.S. economy. We're going to have big refunds coming for a lot of working families that are going to start hitting in the next month to 2 months as people do their tax returns. CapEx and job boom. Tax incentives already driving factory expansion. Boeing's a great example. Employment is accelerating. GE announced, obviously, they're bringing back dishwashers and appliances made back in America. Trump accounts. This is a game changer. This basically seeds at birth $1,000 for each kid invested in the markets. You're now contributing to the U.S. economy and you have part of the U.S. economic system. Very positive. Financial literacy push. This aims to make every American an equity owner, closing the gap for the poor, middle class, and the rich. Long-term legacy. Our Secretary Bessent sees this as a potential, the administration's biggest achievement, merging Wall Street and Main Street prosperity for generations. Overall, optimistic. Remember this. This administration inherited a lot of challenges and a lot of problems from the past administration, but it's being fixed. We are very optimistic at Resnick Wealth Management for 26, 27, and 28. But remember, expect a 10 or 15% pullback before we go to new high ground, or we may go to new high ground before we get any volatility. But again, it's normal. As always, as a client of the firm, if you have any questions or concerns, please call the office and make sure you forward this information on to your friends and family. We appreciate your business, your trust, and we want to give your friends the same great education you're receiving every other week. Have a safe and profitable week.